Hello, comrades. Welcome to the Revolution Report, and welcome to our latest installment of the Chronicles of American Authoritarianism. Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Alex Suarez, who's here. He's a writer, he's an independent journalist. He's been to Venezuela many times, and he's an outspoken activist for and proponent for the freeing of Alex Saab, and he's also an expert of the Alex Saab case. So, Alex, thanks a lot for joining us on the Revolution Report. The first thing I want to ask is just for you to say, tell us a bit about yourself, tell us a bit about the Alex Saab case, and, because not everyone who's watching the Revolution Report maybe knows all the background to it, so if you could give some background information to it as well, and talk about your connection to it.
Absolutely. First off, it's important to note that I've only been to Venezuela once, but I've also traveled to Cuba. I've lived in Latin America. I lived for 3 years in Peru, my father's nation. I'm fluent in Spanish. I maintain contacts down there, and I intend, of course, to return to Venezuela probably in their next elections. I was there as a regional election observer in late 2021. But how I got involved with the Alex Saab case. Well, first off, do you want me to tell people, because not everybody should necessarily be familiar with his case?
Yeah, if you could give some background information to the case.
Absolutely. So Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat. That's the first thing that you need to understand. Therefore, he's guaranteed diplomatic immunity under the believe it's the Geneva Convention. So there are, the Vienna Convention. The Geneva Convention is for POWs. So under the Vienna Convention, he's guaranteed, like any diplomat, special envoy or not, to have diplomatic immunity for prosecution. And so it's been proven in court that he's been a diplomat since 2018. That's also important to understand, because in 2018, the United States still had diplomatic relations with Venezuela, still recognized Maduro as the president of Venezuela. Even though there was tensions, those diplomatic relations still existed. There were still functioning Venezuelan consulates and embassies within the United States. And so at first, to justify extraditing Alex Saab to the United States, the prosecution said, oh, no, he's only been a diplomat since 2019, post-rupture of diplomatic relations. When they proved that he had been a diplomat since 2018, then they said, oh, well, he's not a real diplomat because we don't recognize Maduro, which, of course, is ridiculous. Guaidó is not even in Venezuela anymore. He's in exile in Miami, last I heard. But let's get into how he got extradited, how he got in trouble, and why. My belief, based on my expert analysis of why, that's also important, the why, right? The motivation of why they did this to Alex Saab. So Alex Saab had been, again, functioning as a diplomat for the Venezuelan government since 2018, was going on a humanitarian mission. It was not his first time that he went to Iran. And he was going to Iran, who's been friendly with friendly with Venezuela, to purchase oil in exchange for Venezuelan gold, because they couldn't use Venezuelan currency because of the sanctions. And so that much needed Iranian oil had been brought to Venezuela before, although during the Trump regime, and this was during the Trump era in 2020 when Alex Saab was captured. So during the Trump regime, and Biden did similar things, in international waters, when Iranian vessels brought oil over to Venezuela, in an act of piracy, the United States not only boarded those vessels, stole the oil, and sold it. This is what the U.S. empire does. This is what the lawlessness of the empire is. And so just to give you context of what's going on here. So Alex Saab was on his way to do the mission, as he'd done before, to go to Iran. And what happened? His diplomatic plane, started running out of fuel. And it's common. When you're flying from South America to the Middle East, you make a stopover usually in Africa for refueling. And so while he was entering North African airspace, he was refused entry. And they didn't know why, maybe from U.S. pressure. So because he was refused entry, they had to divert the plane, and finally they were accepted to land in Cape Verde Island off the coast of Africa. And what happened in Cape Verde? The authorities, who never produced an Interpol warrant, completely illegally, against his diplomatic immunity, boarded the plane, ignored his diplomatic papers, and forcibly removed him from the plane soon after. And we know this from Alex Saab books that came out, and I also wrote my own book on this case, that he was tortured by U.S. agents, by American English-speaking agents that had their faces covered, physically tortured, beaten to the point of losing teeth. This is a cancer survivor. that was denied his cancer medication. He was psychologically and physically tortured. The UN had already looked into that. And they were trying to have him give dirt or something on Maduro. And so he refused to cooperate. And so he was held for over a year in Cape Verde. Then you had a change of president, right, to Biden. And what did Biden do? Biden had him extradited to Miami. It's important to know also the timing of this, right? So they had presidential elections in Cape Verde. And the presidential candidate who won promised to give in to what the public was demanding, what the African Union was demanding. And Cape Verde is part of the African Union. He was saying, I'm going to free Alex Saab. What happened the day before the inauguration? Alex Saab was extradited to Miami. And so the cruel treatment, the cruel treatment is detailed in my book, The Diplomat, that's in a few languages now, under the name R Suarez. But the point is, he was brought to Miami. It's also important to understand that there was originally, I believe, 6 federal charges against him. There's only 1 remaining. Now, there's a theory that, Cape Verde somehow negotiated the United States for him to be sent to the United States. They'd have to drop most of the charges. That's not true. Cape Verde doesn't have that power. What happened is there's absolutely no evidence of any of the charges. It's all political. They're trying to make an example of Alex Saab for defying U.S. sanctions. That's the reason. That's the main reason. And so what happened? The one federal charge, anybody that tells you that Alex Saab, and don't Google the word Alex Saab, it's full of lies. Google free Alex Saab. But anyways, anybody that tells you he's charged with money laundering, as the media tends to say, they're defaming him. That's absolutely false. The only charge that remains against Alex Saab currently in the courts is for conspiring to money launder, which is based completely on hearsay without any factual evidence whatsoever. I know that because I attended all the hearings, the preliminary hearings, when nobody that was supportive of Alex Saab was going yet. And also the latest hearing, the diplomatic status hearing, where we had several supporters enter the courtroom down in Miami. I went for that. I live in Northeast Florida. I drove down there to show my support. And so here comes 2021. Within days of his extradition to Miami, I go to Venezuela because there's regional elections. I was invited as an election observer. I meet with Camila Fabre de Saab, who is an Italian Venezuelan national who is the wife of Alex Saab. And Alex Saab is a Colombian Venezuelan national as well, who's been a diplomat again since 2018, if you're just coming in now. And so he's been held on this one charge, although unlike other countries, the United States still has high sentences. Has higher sentences than normal for these types of charges. So just on that one charge, he could still go to 20 years in prison. And so what's going on here? They're trying to use him to pressure Maduro's government. And they're trying to use him as an example to others who will defy U.S. sanctions using their diplomatic protection. Just as like there's no longer protections for journalists or publishers like Assange, there's no longer now protections for diplomats because it's proven with an abundance of evidence that he is a diplomat. And so that's what's been going on with Alex Saab.
Yeah, the situation, it really reminds me, I think it's part of a trend that the United States has been embarking upon for a while of trying to, at any cost, weed out people that potentially pose some sort of obstacle to the imposition of U.S. sanctions on countries that are trying to defend themselves. Because there was also a pretty similar case. I mean, he wasn't a diplomat, but he was a citizen of another country, a British citizen named Christopher Ems. He's on the FBI's most wanted list right now because he allegedly helped North Korea get around U.S. sanctions using cryptocurrency. Allegedly. He denies this, and he's not even a U.S. citizen, but still the United States wants him extradited to the U.S., and he only found asylum in Russia, where he's living right now. So it's sort of a similar situation. I wanted to ask you, how did Alex Saab help Venezuela economically, would you say?
That's a very good question. So Alex Saab is one of the founders of the CLAP program. That's an abbreviation. So the CLAP program saved millions of Venezuelan lives, and it's almost like a food stamp program here in the United States. And so it's a program where, low-income people that can't get access to food, especially because of these sanctions, Alex Saab was able to use his connections in the Middle East, he's Middle Eastern descent, to bring not only the oil that Venezuela needed because they couldn't refine their own oil, they couldn't export the oil because of those sanctions, but also to bring in much-needed food and medicine. And so the CLAP program, Alex Saab's diplomatic connections, which are maintained to this day, even though he's held in Miami, is what helped bring up the Venezuelan population. The United States was aware of this. The United States was infuriated by this, and we're trying to find a way to falsely accuse Alex Saab of something and to hold him despite of his the overwhelming evidence of his diplomatic status.
Okay. And what would you say about the economic problems that Venezuela has faced in the recent past? I mean, obviously the United States says that it's the result of some sort of socialist failure, economic mismanagement. What would you say it generally comes from?
So one of the most respected UN rapporteurs, Manuel de Zaya, determined back in 2020 that U.S. sanctions had killed at least 100,000 Venezuelan civilians alone. And it's important to understand what the population of Venezuela is. It's relatively low in comparison to other Latin American nations. Obviously, several people left Venezuela also because of these economic imposed sanctions. But there are approximately only 28 million people living in Venezuela today. So 100,000 people, again, those numbers have gone up the past 3 years. But if you just look at the 100,000, now per capita, if you look at our population, which is over 300 million, it'd be like killing 30 million Americans through sanctions. And 30 million happens to be the approximate number, as you know, of Soviets that were killed by the Nazi onslaught more than any other nation. So that's how significant the 100,000 is, which again has gone up. So a lot of the old people, people with immunity problems, the children, their entire generations of people have been wiped out by these terroristic sanctions that are targeting the civilian population of Venezuela, which only make the government more popular. I was an election observer. I know how popular Maduro is. There are people that if these sanctions didn't exist, might have gone over to the opposition, but because they're so pissed, because they know Maduro's doing everything he can to fight these sanctions, they know they're targeting Venezuela because of their leadership, that's going to make them want to support Maduro's government even more. So the sanctions don't even work for their purpose. It's just stupid, terroristic, genocidal policies.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your experience as an election observer. How do the elections work over there? What would be your assessment of how democratic they are?
So we have a saying here in the United States: blue no matter who, or red no matter who. Red representing Republicans and blue representing Democrats. That's partisanship. That's anti-democratic as they come. In the elections in Venezuela, you never see the political party of the candidate. So when I was at the voter booth and we had full access, you had several observers from all over the world, 500 I heard. The EU was there this time, the Carter Center, etc. All these observers, including myself, we had full access. And so when I was at the voting booth, one of the many we went to that day, somebody was complaining, oh, it doesn't show the political party. And I thought, if only they did that in the United States, because they show up and they're educated on who the candidates are, right? Most of the voters are educated on who the candidates are, because just because somebody joins a party, they could be infiltrating the party, they could have a hidden agenda. So the people go there knowing who their gubernatorial and municipal candidates are. And I find that much more democratic.
Yeah, it's similar to Cuba, to the Cuban system, where campaigning, like in the way that in the United States it's done, that basically makes it a circus, is not allowed during political running for political office. That's very.
And when Obama took over the first time around, he appointed Geithner, his treasurer, who was the same treasurer under Bush. That wouldn't happen in Cuba, because in Cuba they actually vote for who the cabinet is.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, they had things like in most U.S. states, you don't get a receipt showing how you voted. In Venezuela, you're guaranteed a receipt. I saw the receipts myself. So when you vote, they're very transparent. They show how you vote. They reached an agreement with the opposition. I believe it's 40% now, where there's an automatic audit, the highest audit in the world. No other country has an audit that large that automatically they do after the election to verify them. And so everybody approved. The EU, opposition observers, the Carter Center, all these people that in prior elections were reluctant to go, said, you know what, we're going to go ahead now. And they said, no, it's still democratic. It's just as democratic as it was under Chavez. It's just as democratic as when Jimmy Carter said they're the most democratic country in the world, Venezuela. And so this system is maintained. And if anything, these genocidal sanctions the past few years, again, has made the government more popular, not less.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, because the way I saw these events connected to Juan Guaidó and the U.S.-backed opposition in Venezuela transpire, it really reminded me of what occurred in the Soviet Union towards the collapse of the USSR. These opposition movements that emerged, like Solidarity in Poland, for example, we can use this as the prime example. It was an anti-Soviet movement, but it was not like anti-left. It was not a self-proclaimed fascist organization or right-wing organization. It was actually an organization that proclaimed to be left-wing. And so through this way, you know, the people who were trying to oppose Soviet power there understood that anything that was going to be self-proclaimed right-wing was going to be unpopular, wasn't going to resound with the workers there. And one thing I noticed is that Juan Guaidó also is not selling himself as a right-winger. He's sold himself as a left-wing opposition.
Well, in many ways, liberalism is the new fascism, isn't it?
Right.
And, you know, the name of Guaido's small opposition party is a very small and significant party. It's got a lot more attention the past few years, but in a negative way. It's the name, even the name of his party is ironic. The name of his party is Voluntad Popular, which means popular will. Where's the popular will for this party to exist? His own opposition voted him out, and they're still going to call him the president of Venezuela, but he's walking around Miami. He's not walking around Caracas. He wasn't thrown out of Venezuela. He escaped because there was pressing charges against him for being a criminal, for being a traitor, for stealing Venezuela's, you know, for giving Citgo over to the United States, stealing their oil, their money. You know, this is what Guaido does, and
how
but
much
yeah,
of the country would
even
you
though
say
Guaido is
sympathizes
really a
with him?
far right person, we know that. His rhetoric is actually liberal, kind of liberal center, and Voluntad Popular claims to be a liberal party, but they're not functioning as one whatsoever.
And how much do you think? How much would you say the country sympathizes with Guaido?
I'll tell you this: I've seen countless footage of Guaido walking the streets of Caracas and going to restaurants, and every single time he's thrown out.
Nice.
And he always has to have private security around him, probably American agents, because no Venezuelan want to work for him.
Right.
But he's so unpopular, he can't show his face anywhere. He can't go anywhere without stones being thrown at him. And the Venezuelans are very peaceful people. I've talked with them. But when you have that level of treason, a person who's free, I mean, if Maduro's such a brutal dictator, why didn't he have Guaido shot? There is no death penalty in Venezuela. He didn't even arrest Guaido. And as a matter of fact, you know, when there was charges against him, he was still able to escape the country. And he couldn't stay in Colombia anymore because now even Colombia has good relations with Venezuela. So he was in Colombia very briefly, and before they realized that he was on a plane, probably a CIA plane, to Miami. And by the way, Guaido, who speaks perfect English, he likes to pretend he doesn't, went to George Washington University, which is down the street from the State Department. And if you know anything about the State Department in Washington, it's heavily infiltrated by the CIA. So I think this guy was groomed for this from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, moving on to a bit of a different topic. Would you say that the Venezuelan system right now is socialist, or is it, for example, a government trying to bring it towards socialism? How would you assess the system that's in place right now in Venezuela?
I think if social programs like the CLAP program are indisputably socialist, or at least based on socialist principles. That I do believe. I think that Venezuela wants to be even more socialist and have a stronger socialist economy. It's prevented from doing that because of the sanctions. But again, the sanctions don't have their intended effect, which really is regime change. The sanctions are not meant to end socialism. They're meant to have a regime change so that they can put in a puppet like Guaido. And they have not been successful in that regard. So I think once their diplomatic efforts are successful in lifting those sanctions, that Venezuela could become more socialistic as well.
Well, you wrote a book about a lot of this. Why don't you tell us a bit about it and what's in it?
Yeah, so the Diplomat covers Alex Saab Case. It's also a little bit semi-autobiographical, more of a writer than a journalist. So I put myself in because I say, okay, this is why I went to Venezuela. This is who I met. This is what's going on with Alex Saab. You know, and I'm very proudly on my wall here, I have a picture of both Julian Assange and a letter from Alex Saab that he wrote to me. So I've been in touch with Alex Saab now. He knows about me, and he's a hero, just like Assange is against U.S. empire. He was tortured. He never gave in. He you know, heroically went to Iran, knowing that the United States wanted to grab him, leaving his children, his wife behind, knowing the risk, and still doing what he did. That's heroic, you know. Just like Assange gave up his freedom, knowing that he was going to have powerful forces against him, so he could reveal the war crimes and help the end of the war in Iraq and all these other things. And so these gentlemen are truly heroic and deserve our support.
Well, Venezuela, it hasn't really been in the headlines lately. Obviously, the stuff with Guaido happened already several years ago, and obviously the Ukraine conflict has taken front and center ever since the beginning of the Russian military operation. So I wanted to ask you, what would you say the situation on the ground is like now? Has it improved since the times of Trump's attempts to back a coup d'etat in the country?
So when I was in Venezuela, a lot of people know that I went to the gravesite of Hugo Chavez and Boulevard, but I also went to factories. They had us give full tours of different factories and show what it's been like since the U.S. corporations left Venezuela. And now they're starting to recuperate. Before they didn't have toilet paper. Now they're making their own toilet paper so they don't have to rely on imports from their factories. And they're even exporting a little bit. And so because of their allies in Russia and China, because of the socialist system and the efforts of people like Alex Saab, they're starting to get on their feet again. There's still economic problems, but it's not as crazy or genocidal as it was before 2021.
And what,
especially during COVID. During COVID, they couldn't even import, syringes, nor could Cuba. So Cuba made their own ones and sent them to Venezuela. And then Venezuela also got some Chinese vaccines that they needed for COVID. But yeah, COVID made the situation even worse for them as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Venezuela's relations with countries like Russia and China. They're talking about multipolarity a lot these days, the end of the unipolar rule of the American empire over the world and the emergence of various countries can exist and conduct diplomacy on more or less equal terms. How do you think Venezuela is going to, what role is it going to play in this new multipolar world that's emerging?
Well, what's interesting about Venezuela is unlike countries like Argentina, which went back to the right for some time and, of course, were in economic decline as a result. They took the IMF loans that ruined the economy. From 1999 to the present, Venezuela has stayed a socialist government. Very democratic, several elections, but they've stayed a socialist government. So they're an example to other Latin American nations, much like Cuba has been. In South America, the only countries that have stayed socialist from 1999 to the present is Venezuela. So they're an example against the U.S. empire, defying the U.S. empire. And that's why the United States have been trying to sabotage that example and sabotage the efforts of people like Ambassador Alex Saab.
I'd like to also ask another question about democracy, because in Venezuela, obviously they have a democratic system, there's a socialist party in power. But the thing that comes to mind in terms of South American democratic socialist countries is that they run the risk of going the way of Salvador Allende in Chile, unfortunately, where the CIA had him assassinated, right?
No, actually, it was proven by autopsy that Allende killed himself. And it's understandable why, because he knew that the forces that were taking over the country would have tortured him to death anyways. So he died with honor. But right. I agree with you that it is dangerous. There is a danger for a coup in Venezuela, much like you saw in 1973 in Chile. The difference is Comandante Chavez came from the armed forces. Mm-hmm. And they were able to politicize the armed forces in Venezuela, unlike Chile, learning from the Chilean example. 25 years later, after the fall of Allende, the elections in 1998 in Venezuela made a socialist government there, which helped inspire other movements throughout Latin America, was called the Pink Tide, and we're starting to see a reemergence of that. And so, because they politicized the armed forces, because Chavez came from the armed forces, that helped prevent a coup. Now, Maduro, who was very close to Chavez, obviously, is not from the armed forces. But he has support of people that were part of the armed forces that were alongside that were alongside Chavez, like Cabello, for example. Something else important to understand. When people look up Alex Saab's name, even if they put in free Alex Saab, eventually they're going to see some lies about him. So it's important to understand. So they're claiming that he's a DEA informant, which is ridiculous. They wouldn't have tortured him if that was true. They said he informed back in the day. It's also important to understand that after Chavez died in 2013, the DEA claimed that Maduro was their informant, and he was informing against Cabello, who was the number 3 in the Chavista government. So these lies are quite obvious. So what happened in actuality was, in 2018, soon after Alex Saab, who was a businessman, and it's common for business people, including socialist business people, to become diplomats. He was a supporter of the Chavista government. So when he became a diplomat, the DEA wanted to question him about one of his businesses in Colombia, and he wanted to go meet the DEA to clear his name, and he had the permission. Maduro admitted this after this came out. He had the permission from Maduro's government to meet with the DEA. So the DEA took advantage of that one meeting to say, oh, look, he's informing for us. But, they have no credibility whatsoever. This is a way to try to discredit and demoralize the Free Alex Saab movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, what kind of political work are you doing in the United States to advance the Free Alex Saab movement?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I had an event recently. Well, I was at the rally March 18th in D.C. I hadn't been in D.C. in a while. the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, the peace rally, really, for peace in Ukraine. And soon after that, in actually on May 6th and 7th, so not too long ago, we had a Raging Against Imperialism event. So an anti-imperialist event, which was at a campgrounds where we had workshops on educating people on anti-imperialism outside of Gainesville, Florida. I think I mentioned earlier I'm in Jacksonville, Florida, so it wasn't too far away. And that anti-imperialist event, was in solidarity with the Uhuru and the other comrades that are suffering from imperialism here at home and, of course, abroad, as mentioned. And actually, if that's okay, I gave a brief speech at the campgrounds that I'd like to share with you.
Go ahead.
It's a text I'd like to read.
Sure.
Okay, just a moment. It is time for working class voices in the South to be raised, from Appalachia to Florida. It is time for oppressed nations to be raised, from America Latina to within the U.S. It is time to expose imperialism at home and abroad. Comrades, we have heroic movements and heroic figures being persecuted under the guise of the law, known as lawfare, for essentially thinking like us in a socialist or anti-imperialist fashion. And I'm sick and tired of it. For speaking out for us, the downtrodden, and fighting for us, they suffer. What the imperialists consider the crime of thought, or the crime of acting on thought, sends a dangerous precedent when such things continue to pass, whether it's a diplomat fighting illegal sanctions, like Alex Saab, or a movement fighting imperialism in Florida or other parts of the empire, like our comrades at Uhuru, or the act of journalism to expose U.S. war crimes like we see with the persecution of Assange. I'm fed up with partisanship and hypocrisy as well. DeSantis and his compatriots are silent when the feds raid Uhuru offices in St. Pete, but when the next week they raid Mar-a-Lago, they say abolish the feds. We must speak up for comrades under the gun who cannot speak for themselves. We must lift up the mantle of our sacred causes. Whether it's the cancer of cancel culture or the cancer of reactionaries pretending to be leftists, we must show an alternative path, a path towards revolutionary change. And we must build here a vanguard towards making the conditions of those changes we so desperately need. We must fight for what those who have not yet been born need, as the struggle is on us, and we must fight till our last breath. It is precisely when the imperialists mount campaigns to intimidate us, comrades, that we must be most brave. Brave not with the absence of fear or intelligence, but to control the fear, act accordingly, and rise above, swallowing our egos, working together, not just for unity, but true solidarity.
That's great. Can you tell me a little bit more about what kind of organizations were there, representing the Free Alex Saab movement?
Absolutely. Revolutionary Alliance was there, which is my organization, which has been recognized by Uhuru for our efforts, as well as Anti-Imperialist America. Our comrade Dus Jane was there helping to organize as well. He was with me in Washington not too far back. And so, yeah, we had comrades from the South that emerged there. I can't really get details how many, but for example, my workshop was exclusively on folkism or folkismo, which is a guerrilla strategy invented by Che Guevara. So I went into that, and I went into the history of the Seminole resistance, the Black Seminoles, the runaway slaves who united with the Seminole indigenous people here in Florida and defeated the United States in 3 wars. So we went into that. We thought the historical significance was important because there were Seminoles in the Gainesville area that fled farther south to the Everglades, to the swamplands, that successfully resisted U.S. troops that entered Florida once the Spanish left. So yeah, we had educational workshops. We had walks into the swamp portions of the campgrounds, empowerment sessions, speeches. So I thought it was a good thing to meet with comrades face to face that you interact with online that you not necessarily had met yet, to help form a movement. So not just focus on electoralism, but movement building to pressure those in Washington who are maintaining these imperialist policies, whether it's sanctions against the bank accounts of Uhuru members who are American citizens because of how they think, as mentioned in the speech, or whether there's sanctions against countries abroad that are great examples against U.S. imperialism, like Venezuela.
And what do you think Americans can do to counteract this, U.S. imperialism from the heart of the beast?
Build movements. Build movements within your communities. Talk at the dinner table about Alex Saab. Talk at the dinner table about Assange. Talk about how the United States is using their extraterritorial power to go after citizens under the Espionage Act who aren't even Americans, like Australian citizen Assange, and how these abuses of power are affecting movements fighting for people of color in the working class, oppressed nations, like Uhuru. People say, oh, the feds, COINTELPRO, the Panthers, that was in the 70s. That's not going on now. It's going on right now with the Huru and the federal indictment against them. And we need to show bravery, and we need to show solidarity with them, and not permit these lawfare persecutions to continue on.
So what do you think? What do you think is going to be the future of Venezuela within the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, obviously Maduro is not going to live forever, but I think just like Chavez, he's going to be successful in finding a successor, somebody younger. Maduro is younger than Chavez was, to take over, and it'll be done democratically. It'll be done with respect for the observers and their access to approve those elections. Venezuela is a transparent and open country, has an abundance of oil. They need to diversify their economy. They're working on that. Oil is not going to last forever either. But I think Venezuela has a long history of liberating other nations as well, right? Simon Bolivar, he liberated my father's country, Peru. He liberated several countries in South America from the Spanish imperialists. So the Venezuelans are the descendants of liberators that led these liberating armies, and they're going to continue with dignity for their sovereign rights and for solidarity with other Latin American countries and other countries in the Middle East that are also taking on the empire.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today, Alex.
Okay, been a pleasure.
If you were sharing with us in Venezuela. So thanks again for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us as well, the viewers of The Revolution Report. This was another episode of the Chronicles of American Authoritarianism. There'll be more to come, so definitely stay tuned, and workers of the world, unite.